Hi, we're Paige and Marcus. So our topic was, we started out a little bit too broad, but it ended up narrowing down to, does income affect dam removal prospects? So inspired by the success of the tribally driven Klamath River dam removal of 2024, we investigated a less obvious but commonly cited stakeholder effect in dam removal, the income of those living around a dam-formed water source.
Yeah, so we took inspiration from the 2024 Klamath dam removal, but we actually went and took a look at like big data sets of dams that were removed and dams that were not removed. And then we from that we wanted to see if there was a relationship between like a correlation between that between like people's income that live like the median income for the zip codes that we used GeoIDs to then like merge the data set with the removed and not removed dams. And then yeah, so um
The reason why we specifically chose income is because we wanted to explore that wealth relationship. But we couldn't use property values specifically because we would have to use different property values from across many different years to correlate with the removal years of dams. So that just got kind of unfeasible. And we wanted to see that through income. So we found a set of removed dams and then a set of not removed dams. And as he was mentioning, we had to merge them. That did lead to some issues with sample sizing, however, because there is not a lot of data on removed dams. So that sample was pretty small.
yeah. So yeah, I guess as I mentioned before, the methodology that we were using was what we had ended up having to do was use the GeoIDs, which are like they can for like a certain zip code, they'll like be able to, link the data sets to be able to use them. And yeah, so we ended up using the like what was it, the US National Inventory of dams, and then the American Community 5-year 2022 survey on income. And then we went on R and we did some analysis. And you want to tell them about the results?
Yes. Results were interesting. There is a correlation that we found. It is pretty mild, as you can tell. It's only like 0.1-ish, 0.09. There is a relationship there, but because of, again, the difference in sample sizes, I would say it's not statistically significant. Here, sorry. Let's go up here to the results. So I guess we can talk a little more about the specifics. The interquartile range, pretty wide. It was pretty wide for both the removed and not removed dam groups. So that is the underpinning issue with our outcomes. However, that correlation is still pretty interesting. So in the end, we decided to recommend more data. And we'll get into a lot more of the specifics of like what the problems were with taking such a wide amount of data for very unique dam situations. I'm going to talk about some of these.
Yeah, so I guess like it suggests basically a slight tendency for higher income, to be to be associated with not removing dams, right? But I feel like this relationship that we're looking for is actually really complicated. Like for example, the Klamath River one itself is like it's a lot more complicated than just these numbers. I think we can, for like next time, we can definitely kind of explore more parameters, I guess. But yeah, like I was looking into the Klamath River one. Like I really looked like took a look at what was happening, and I mean, it started by like 100 years ago. It was 100 years ago they created this dam system so that they can electrify that part of the world for the first time ever, right? But then, you know, 100 years later, the tribe and like the tribes that lived there, in the Yurok reservation, they really were starting to fight for, because it's like a part of their life. It's a part of their religion. Uh, it, they eat from the fish, the salmon that are, um, there's a type of fish that lives in the ocean primarily, and then swims upstream the rivers to um to like lay their eggs and spawn, and then that's really important for them to be able to swim up that river, right? And so we want to be able to analyze other things like that as well, like the fish population and stuff for when we continue to explore this.
Yeah, so I think just to add on to that, so basically the different variables for dam removal are highly specific and unique to each dam. Part of that problem being, for example, the majority of dams are used for agricultural and industrial mining purposes. So we wanted to look at something different, but that in itself has an effect because you have really high value properties around certain lakes, for example, that are really expensive properties. And then you have mining communities or industrial agricultural communities built around serving whatever purpose that kind of dam has. And those are really, really low income. So essentially, like, that kind of couldn't be controlled for in this particular analysis. But I mean, it'd be interesting to look at both of those. Let's see. So yeah, more collection on locations of removed dams is recommended because we were highly limited there. And we'd like to talk about the challenges. So I noticed finding data was actually a lot harder than I expected. A lot of the portals and like data hubs weren't functioning anymore. And so I would find a really like compelling piece of data, but I'd have to go Google it or go to a different kind of portal hub to find the original source. If you want to talk about like what you experienced when you found that water information, how it had that weird.
Oh yeah, so like at the very beginning of the project, I wanted to use something that I had found called QGIS. It's like it's a tool that allows you to, I guess, even estimate like water flow. Yeah, like how the water will distribute. For example, what I wanted to do was like if you did remove a dam, what would happen to the water flow? But it ended up being like really complicated, and I guess we just I decided like it's gonna take too long. We should just focus on, finding some data that is usable. And so unfortunately we weren't able to use that one, but
yeah, and that continued throughout looking for data. So over and over again we found that when it came to dams and the rivers around it, and also 3D landforms around it, a lot of them used entirely different systems of organization and categorization for the water type, the catchment. So sometimes they would have their data would include multiple dams within one form of data point. So it just kind of became that there would be too many forms of linking required, or there was missing links to where we were kind of limited as to what we could explore around the dams.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and it was our first time using R, and it took a lot of coding, and it was really complicated, but it was fun to learn a new language. And yeah.
Would love to take any questions you have.
Well, thank you. I'm sure we have questions. Let's let Dr. Siopotis start by asking questions.
Yeah, so I have a question regarding the plots that you created. So I see for the box plot, okay, I see the purpose. We can compare, the medium, the IQR. So what's the purpose of the first plot that you have?
That's honestly, a lot of points.
Yeah, it's just to show the limitation of the sample sizes that we were working with. We couldn't really, we didn't have time to get another continuous variable in order to do linear regression. So we just kind of wanted to visually show it. Yeah.
I have a suggestion. So this is great, the box plot. You can see if there is a difference or not. But also there is a hypothesis testing where you can apply like a t-test. You have two groups with the DAM, without the DAM, and you just compare the media income across those different groups. Let's say for a future reference, you know, there is a hypothesis testing where you can apply to, let's say, formally see if there is indeed statistically significant difference or not between these two groups.
And to that point, I noticed you didn't actually write out a hypothesis. What was your hypothesis?
That dam removal and nearby income are correlated.
So that's not, I guess that is a hypothesis, but usually we ask that teams have a directional hypothesis. So if you had been a team who had turned in that proposal, we would have got back to you and said, we need a more specific hypothesis. Correlated how? Negatively correlated, positively correlated? What are you looking at group differences, such as what Dr. Siapotis said? Do you expect income to have changed in a particular direction? Mm-hmm. Or were you not looking at change? Were you just looking at income around where the dam was? And if that's the case, I wondered, were you looking at income before the dam was removed or after the dam was removed?
Yeah, that was actually a huge limitation for us, because a lot of these dams also didn't have the removal year. So it was kind of difficult to get a bunch of different data sets on the income of those years and this. I think that maybe this topic was a little too broad for us.
And so that's a good thing to learn. I mean, that's why we do mock DataJam projects in this class, is you can really learn from this, and that learning can help you mentor teams. And I think your question was broad also. And I would say more than half of the teams have questions that are too broad to start with. And so as mentors, a lot of time you're working with the team to try to get them to understand that and to narrow it down. The fact that you have experience with this now, you'll be able to make a more convincing argument to them. Look, I've tried to do this and I was too broad, so I know that we need to make it narrower. That often helps. I also wondered what you called the vicinity of the dam. Was it just the zip code that the dam was in? And were there dams that had multiple zip codes abutting up to them?
That's a good question. We did just a single zip code. So originally the longitude and latitude coordinates gave us a geo ID. So it's actually not a zip, it's a specific census code designation. I don't believe that's the same as a zip code. I don't know if there were like multiple.
So, but you were looking at a census tract, and those are
definitely the one that it was located within.
Okay. And so you found income divided by census tract also?
We didn't do income divided by census tract. We got income per census tract.
Okay.
The median.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions from individuals that are online? You can put your question in the chat, or you can just call it out. I'm going to open the chat here. Okay, or in person. Questions for the team?
I have more questions.
Yeah.
So you said you cleaned the data. What exactly did you do? What do you mean cleaning the data? You had missing values, or what type of cleaning do you do there?
There were some missing values. We also removed all of the irrelevant information from some of them. So there was stuff, there were parameters in some of the data sets that weren't shared between the two. So we removed that. What else?
So you also removed the missing values, right? You said you also removed missing values. Okay.
Yeah. in the second script. Yeah.
I don't see any questions online. Any questions in Pittsburgh? So besides having a broad topic, are there other things you feel you learned from the project that would be of value to mentors as they move into mentoring teams themselves?
I definitely feel like both of us did. I took a lot of pictures of both of our scripting process as it went back and forth. So there was a lot of like just trying to figure out what exactly we were trying to do, how we were trying to clean it. And then also, I think we both have pictures of all of the data search like we did. So all of the problems we came across in finding the right data and issues with the portals, learning R.
Yeah.
And also learning to create the poster. So this in itself was kind of a challenge, learning how to make it presentable and present all of the information required without kind of overwhelming. That was something we worked on.
And just overall,
Yeah.
how to create like a actual data science project. Like
Yeah, the whole
direction of
flow
it.
was all new for us.
Mhm.
Okay, well, that's good. That makes me happy to hear that. That's exactly what we're trying to teach you. And I think it's really important that finding data sets is without a doubt the most difficult thing for most teams. And so where they're really going to need help from mentors is in finding data sets. And I want to remind you about something I said last week, which is if you as mentors have trouble helping them, reach out to me. I have a ton of contacts, and I often can find people who might know how to find a particular data set. So we really try to be a resource to those teams. We're not trying to impede them in any way in undertaking their project. We're really trying to facilitate them being able to do it. And they often need help with finding data sets. So let me know, and I'm happy to kind of mobilize people, which doesn't mean that we will be able to find a data set that they need. It means that we can have a number of people who are pretty good at information science and data science looking into it, but very frequently the data set that a group envisions will be there just doesn't exist at all. And so you have to pull from multiple data sets, or the data may not be available. And that's part of learning about data science. So we feel it's a really valuable part of the learning process. But thank you. Really nice job. We have a group here in Pittsburgh. Do you guys want to come?
Yeah, we're missing.
We don't have Ayush.
Well, can you do it without
We
him?
can,
Because we can't wait
can
longer,
do
I
the-
don't think.
Beginning stuff, and then do you want to just do
Yeah,
the
I can
full
do
data
that.
section? Okay.
I'll let you pull it up, and we will share the screen. Okay, so it's shared, and I'm going to put the chat up. And you should be able to look over here when you're done, because people can post questions right there.
Start with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Our project was on comparing gun violence and anti-gun protests across the U.S. And so, well, it's kind of straightforward. Our hypothesis was that we think that more anti-gun protests would be actually indicative of more gun violence. I remember we talked about this. And
Okay.
I remember
Which comes first?
Which one comes
That's
first? So after thinking about it a little bit more, I was thinking, oh, maybe it would make sense that in areas that are experiencing a lot more gun violence, we would expect more people to take to the streets to kind of try and raise awareness of the issue, and hopefully to get some reform in that area. I think that's everything for the
So we
start.
can state our actual broad research question, which was, does the number of anti-gun protests in the U.S. have a significant influence on gun-related death rates by state? And so we did try to investigate specifically from protest to violence, not from violence to protest. And we expected that the number of gun protests would show a lower number of gun-related death rates in a given state. Do you want to go over where we got the data sets from?
So to find data on the actual protests, I don't remember the name of it. I found a really big data set from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data organization, who had this really nice large data set on not just protests in the US, but also in Canada, which we ended up cleaning that to be just the US. And it was, I think, from 2020 through 2024, had lists of just a lot of documentation on what protests happened in which states. For Canada, I'm not sure how they broke it down. We weren't really concerned with Canada. But also listed, who were the people organizing the protests, if any. There were a lot of missing values for that. And then I don't know if you wanted to talk about filtering, but we ended up filtering that by a list of organizations that we researched to actually see how many of them listed like anti-gun things or pro-gun reform as kind of like part of their actual like mission statement. So we were able to limit the data set we used by actually organizations that were like officially anti-gun or pro-gun reform. And then we used US Census data for our gun-related deaths rates by state. And then, oh yeah, I forgot about the third one. And then we'll talk a little bit more on this later on in the challenges section, but one big issue that we were thinking about a lot was that of confounding variables that we talked about a little earlier. And so we were able, one of the variables we chose to control for was actually how strong is each US state's gun legislature, and how strong is each one when it actually comes to gun reform and things like background checks and other gun safety things. And where was this? There was a website we found called Everytown for Gun Safety, and they created their own metric for each state that was based on, which laws are active in that state, how strong is the actual policy on gun safety. And they weighed them. Each state was weighed from 0 to 100, and then the website goes through a breakdown of how they actually went to calculate their index for that. And I think they grouped laws and policies into 3 weighted levels. Some that background checks were among like the highest weighted, and then they just broke them up into different levels, and those were...
I can give a little bit more information about the 3 groups independently and what they stand to do. So the ACLED collects every reported protest by police department and aggregates them by state level. This includes things that aren't related to gun protests. So there are a lot of, it's just every protest that is reported across the US by police departments. A lot of them aren't reported, which is an interesting thing that we wanted to note because our sample size was really small and we didn't expect to see that. However, it was the largest data set that we could find that provided data across the US. There are several places that were not represented, but we also didn't expect to see anything from them. They're very low populous states, and obviously you'd expect to see some more protests in more populated areas because there's more people to protest. The US Census collects, it was their, I guess it was 2014 to 2022, so it wasn't the 5-year summary, it was just the complete set from 2014 to 2022. However, since the ACLED only has 2020 to 2024, we were only able to do this research between the years of 2020 to 2022. That's the years of overlap that we had between the two data sets. Everytown is also a gun protest and gun reform body. They're a nonprofit organization that attempts to educate people on why and how gun reform has led to less gun-related deaths. And so we use their scale of measuring a state's level of fundamental gun laws because they have a very, very indicative procedure that has data tied to it that they also use the US Census to count gun-related deaths. So we figured that they would be a good metric to stand by on measuring gun-related control strength by state. So that being said, another point on data filtering was the ACLED was obviously missing some points on states. So those were filled in by, so there were a lot of factors. The ACLED essentially had entry data of every protest. We filtered that by using a list of 10 specific gun reform groups that are the 10 widest and well-known gun reform groups in America. We figured those would be the largest ones to be participating, and we wanted to make sure that we were being very specific with who we were including. And we can look through their stuff, and they're very much so anti-gun, and we wanted to include those specifically. The US Census had just our gun-related deaths by state, so we added that as another column. And every town had the gun strength or gun law strength by state. So when we do the aggregations of those, what we did find was that there were some states that missed reporting from the US Census across years. We backfilled those with the means across all points. There was always 1 point across all years. So we figured if we fill by mean for that specific state, we essentially say there's no change, we don't affect our alternative hypothesis, and it leans towards the null hypothesis, actually. For the Everytown data, they unfortunately don't backtrack their data on years, so we only had reporting for 2024. Wasn't really what we wanted, but we don't think that it's too far off from 2022 to be indicative of how strong gun control was in previous years. But we will make note that that is a confounding variable that we didn't have accurate reporting times for that. And then, I don't know if I can zoom in here.
Yeah, you can.
When we actually did the data analysis, some initial visualizations were just to look at, in the US, what the gun law strength by state looked like. Is that visible to everybody? So in this, darker colors mean higher gun law strength. Lighter colors would mean a lower strength value. So according to Everytown, people that are below, I believe, 12 points are considered national failures in gun control. And people that are above, I think it's like 67 points are the national successes, where gun control is pretty strict. There's background checks. There's no open carry policies. It's very difficult to carry a gun into a public place and discharge it without repercussion. And then we also did the same thing for the number of protests versus gun-related deaths by state. So for this one, it's a little bit harder to visualize this bidirectional variable for each state. So the size of the circle on each state is the number of protests. The largest number was about 31. I will make note that there is 0.5 in the smallest and largest. That was just an additive value for visualization, so that some of the smaller ones actually show up as dots on the visualization. There's just nothing. And the scale of color is the gun-related deaths per state, with lighter colors meaning that there's less gun-related death, darker colors meaning that there's more. So unfortunately, we didn't have the time to kind of overlay these so that you could see them simultaneously. But if I zoom out a little bit, you might be able to see
It's okay if I comment on one thing about this.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I actually like this visual a lot more. We don't have we didn't run tests to back up the claim that I'm going to make, but looking at this, I think it actually kind of goes against what our original hypothesis was thinking, because if you kind of look and see where more of the protests are, there's a little bit of an inverse relationship that we're seeing, that most of these darker red dots where there's actually a lot of gun-related deaths are a lot of states where you're not seeing a lot of protests.
That supports what we said.
That's what?
That supports what
Oh, that supports what we said? I thought we were doing the opposite.
No.
Oops. Maybe that supports what we said. I thought we were doing.
So yeah, what we can see is that where darker colors line up on the upper map, we do see lighter colors lined up in this lower map. So the New England area up here, we see lighter colors within those regions. Same thing for California, and even up in Washington and Oregon. The interesting part that was not indicative of what we were seeing was areas that surround those darker colored states also seem to reap the benefits of lower gun-related deaths, especially if they're not near or touching states that had higher rates of death. So for example, a good area would be Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, up in the New England area. They are all kind of cut off from any other area that has higher gun-related deaths down in the Midwest or the Panhandle. And they still see lower amounts of gun-related deaths, similar to the amounts that you see in New York, New Jersey, and the New England area. And so that's something that we may have missed, and it might be a confounding variable, that some of these areas might be affected by international state travel, and that kind of the general culture of an area might be more affecting. Some of the interesting things that we did want to point out, though, are, for example, Texas has one of the highest number of protests, and yet nothing has happened with their legislation, according to DataJam. And still they see some benefit from that, in that their gun-related deaths are not as deep red as some of their neighbors over here.
Move on to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Good.
go ahead.
So we'll get to the challenges and recommendations. I just want to say really fast, the analysis that we did run, we ran a multiple regression we ran a multiple regression where we used anti-gun protests as a predictor to try and predict deaths by state, and then we controlled for gun law strength by state. We didn't find a actually, I'll break it down. When we looked at the multiple regression results, we found that gun law strength by state was significant as a predictor, so it was definitely good that we included it in the model. But after the inclusion of gun law by strength, actually the inclusion doesn't matter. With or without it, I don't think that the number of protests ended up actually being significant in predicting death rates by state. And so one of the things that we just wanted to note was that even if we had found a significant relationship, it's not indicative that there is a causal relationship between protests themselves actually decreasing gun-related deaths by state. It just would have been that they, follow similar patterns. And then one of the big challenges that I talked about a little bit earlier was confounding variables. We only included one control in our model. It's very possible that we would have needed to add a bunch of other ones that we didn't control for. A couple that I listed were demographic, political climate, and also media coverage are all things that really could have confounded the relationship we were looking into. And then another challenge. Okay, originally when we were tackling this, we were curious to see if there were time effects between periods of protest, and then seeing, did these protests actually cause, or were they associated with decreases, or I guess increases in deaths? Either one would have been interesting.
We wanted to examine whether or not protests had a change in gun-related deaths across time, and that whether or not year to year a continuous number of gun protests showed a decrease in gun-related deaths across time. Doing that for every state was a little bit out of the scope of the time that we had available, so we decided to cut down and just look at ignoring time, do we see a relationship between protests and gun-related deaths?
And I realized I ran through the notes and recommendations first for the challenges. And then we have the 3 tools that we used from the website.
So what were the challenges?
The challenges were figuring out which confounding variables to use, actually trying to see, can we find data to control for any of them. I didn't even think we were going to actually find data, strong data on state gun control levels. Ayush actually was the one that pulled that, and I realized this would actually be a great control to include. But ideally, I would have wanted to. I think the time one was the one I was most interested in, because if there was any way we could have tried to see about mirroring a randomized control trial in any way, I would have wanted to look at before and after effects of the protests themselves, but that would have been a lot more work for us to tackle. Yeah.
Another large challenge was doing the visualization of the entire US, especially for multiple variables that are trying to be visualized at the same time. We can't really do a visualized multiple regression for our 2 variables. I think it would have been nice to show an individual. We also did individual models of just gun control strength and protests individual of themselves, and then we also did the multiple regression. It would have been nice to do those and visualize those as well, kind of thinking after finishing. But definitely working through learning Tableau was tough. It took me several hours to just figure out how to get the map to show up in the first place. So working with new software, and especially trying to map however you've organized your data in Excel to do statistical analyses, and then having to visualize them with a different software was an interesting hill to climb.
Well, thank you. Dr. Tsipotis.
A lot of questions.
Yes.
But I will ask the most important one. So you said it's a really small sample size. So
It
how
was-
Was it?
small-
It was 230.
Okay.
Relative to what I would have expected, which would be close to the thousands.
The original
right?
data set had
7,000 entries.
I thought it
So
had more than that.
2,000, or sorry, 200.
Of protests.
Yeah.
7,000 protests across the US and Canada between the years that we were looking at. You bring that down to just the specific years and just these specific protests, it drops to 230, which was a little disheartening, but
Okay, and you also consider the total number of deaths, right, from guns. Do you think that you may see different patterns, different trends if you separate them in different types of deaths? Let's say if it's by accident, or if it's a suicide, or if it's a homicide. So
yeah.
do you think you may see a difference?
We definitely do think that would happen. However, since gun laws span such a variety that, if you are able to have an open carry law, you can accidentally shoot yourself in the leg or foot, and if there's nobody around, you will bleed out. But that is reflected in the fact that if you're in a state where you don't have an open carry law, that's just not possible, right? So I think it would be an interesting thing to look at those. I think it would be a much more complicated task to separate them out.
Yeah.
We were actually, sorry.
No,
Can I say
go
that? Before we kind of changed up how we were planning on doing this, I was actually thinking of looking specifically at protests where there were violent interactions specifically with firearms, whether that was from police intervention or if it was I don't know, counter protests that turned violent, to even further hone in on ones where it was actually an issue within the protest itself. We did not end up doing that.
Okay,
But
that's fine. Also, another thing that you may consider is basically the size of the protest. Not just whether or not there was a protest, but also the size, right? I mean, that's also
That's the issue is that there's no
Data.
I don't think
there's no data
I don't
on
know if
head
we
count
had,
at
yeah.
protests.
Okay.
There's no RSVP to these things, so the amount of people that show up and leave halfway through, or show up and stay the whole time, or come late, and
it would have been nice if the data set at least had a categorical, large, medium,
Sure,
small.
yes.
It didn't. We didn't have that either.
yeah, they pretty much only identified whether or not it became hostile.
Yes. I also agree that I feel that the nature of the data is more like a time series data. It would be very interesting to see how the data change over time. I think that would be something. But I agree, maybe out of the scope of this class. Okay, another concern is like, I'm expecting your data sets, you may have a lot of outliers. Because some states have a lot of, like a high population, you may have a lot of like high numbers of protests, high numbers of deaths, but some other states, they may have very small ones.
Since we were able to, since we did this with essentially, it was a roundabout way of using a categorical variable. We could have used state as a control, as a
Or we
grouping
could have
variable.
split it by bigger, smaller
Or
states.
find a way to standardize somehow your data.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think standardizing death rate would have been
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
However, it was not controlled for in the best way possible, but it was semi-controlled for, given that the strength of the law by state is typically never the same value as another. So it almost acts as a categorical variable in and of itself in the multiple regression. That usually, like, a specific death rate associated with one specific gun strength was never going to be the same in a different state. And so it's roundabout, I agree, but
I think that's
yeah.
Do you have any questions online?
I don't think so.
No, doesn't look.
People online are welcome to ask questions. You can do so out loud or in the chat. How about in Pittsburgh? Questions?
With all the confounding variables, did you ever think to like do it on a smaller scale, like just Pennsylvania, or did you always want to do like the entire US?
No, we definitely thought about just comparing what it would look like in a state that had higher gun strength and one that had lower, and compare the differences. But since the US is such an interesting place, and each state is essentially an individual culture of its own, and given that we were able to find data across the entire US mostly, it definitely was of no issue to us to just do it across the whole state so that we don't have to run into anything of like this specific state or this specific state. We can kind of more closely address our original research question instead of having to narrow down to specific states.
I do like that idea though of like breaking it up and saying, okay, like here are some states that have had more controversy with like their gun safety. We'll look at their protests to see if it changed anything versus like states where we know that are already relatively safe. I think it would have been a good way to organize it too.
Oh, I guess we never actually did our conclusion, which was that we did not find that the number of protests was a significant influence on gun-related deaths. However, yeah. However, we did not. This does not say that they do nothing. We want to make that very clear that that does not mean that gun protests do not have any effect. It's more likely that if we were to do a relationship between protests and gun strength, that we'd see some more relationship between those two variables, and that if we were to do the time series analysis, including a connection between gun strength and protests, we might see a two-way relationship where protests lead to gun law strength, which leads to lower rates of death. But we don't have any actual conclusions on that.
Time series, yeah. What do you feel you learned by doing this project that you can carry over to mentoring?
I think one of the things I learned, like when we sat down the first day to talk about this, all I was thinking about was time series, and also I was like, oh, I fortunately I had the nice opportunity of taking the time series course here at Pitt, but I don't remember a lot from it. But I think one of the things that I'm actually encountering this already with the group that I'm working with is that if the first approach that you think of ends up actually being a little more complicated than you think it would have been at face value, learning how to change your approach to something that you can actually do within the scope of the DataJam project, I think is a big thing. Like my group wants to do COVID rates over time to see how over time that would change national park attendance. And I'm trying to think of ways where, maybe after controlling for a couple things, maybe can I see like, oh, can we just look at a correlation, or can we, can I simplify it? So I think it was really good in making me think of what are other ways we can try to tackle a similar problem and try to answer maybe not the same, but at least still like a very similar relevant question.
Again, narrowing the focus of the research question down to something that's doable in the time period. Right
Yeah.
now, you're mentoring community college teams, and they have to complete their project in one semester, which is different. They are a little more advanced than high school teams, but they have half the period of time, and that's going to have an impact. So this will be very valuable to think about how can you get them to narrow their question.
I would also like that was kind of what I wanted to echo in that is like several times we had to kind of reevaluate the scope of the question that we wanted to answer with both what we had available and the time we had allotted, and knowing those constraints kind of helped be specific in the question, in both identifying the research question and specifically what hypothesis we wanted to test within that question. And then on my end, I would say this was my first time integrating data in Excel specifically. I had to do it a lot in like software like R, but I wanted to try and do it in Excel. And using Power Query and learning the free version of Tableau was definitely a new experience, and being limited on time and I guess not really having anyone to teach me through it and kind of having to learn it in an independent environment, I think it has definitely prepared me to give advice on how to do that for other people.
Good. If there are no other questions, thank you very much.